Hey, everybody. Welcome to our little podcast panel. Thanks for joining us. My name is Brian Nitzel, if I've not had the pleasure to meet you yet. And I head up an organization called Making Things Right, where we're trying to just do our little part in the broader work of reforming the Christian response to LGBTQ plus people. These days, that sort of mission may sound ridiculous. And that we as a country and as a broader church are going in the wrong direction. But behind the scenes, in my work, I get to observe a lot of curious Christians and even a reasonable number of evangelical churches really rethinking what it means to love our LGBTQ plus neighbor. And so I'm encouraged, but I also recognize the landscape in which we're in as well, and finding hope in this arena is not an easy thing. So today we're going to talk about the long game and LGBTQ plus reform in the Christian church. And my hope and our hope is to give each other some hope around this stuff and to illustrate the challenges for sure, but also the potential and some of the advancements in non-affirming spaces, whether it be your family or your church or your community. All right? And the good news is it's not just all about me, because that would be, well, it might be okay, but might get a little boring. So I got 4 friends up here, individuals who are, in their own way and spaces are advocating for my community, the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm going to let them take a little bit of time to introduce themselves and the work that they do, but I'll just briefly. This is Brit Barron, a new friend of mine, who is a fabulous queer advocate and author and speaker. My good friend, Grace Thomas, a wonderful trans advocate and a 30-year Assemblies of God minister. I got that wrong once. I thought it was Baptist, and you're like, where'd you get that memo? But, Bill White, a good friend of mine, a pastor as well as a founder of an organization that coaches and consults churches, specifically those maybe in the earlier stages of considering inclusion and affirmation within their church environment. And then last but not least, Danny Cortez, who is also a pastor and also a founder of an organization doing similar work. So, and why don't we just, take a minute or two for each of you, just to let people know just kind of who you are. And I'll start. Brian Nitzel, live in Atlanta. I'm married. If you had asked me about 10 years ago, I would have said that was not possible and God would not allow that. So that's part of my story. So that's no one's more surprised than me. I also have 2 teenage girls. No one's more surprised than me of that as well. We just sent one off to college, lots of tears. And it's just been such a wonderful joy. I explained a little bit of my work, but I try to help invite and resource Christians and church leaders who are maybe a little earlier on the path of rethinking what it means to love their LGBTQ plus neighbor from a more compassion-centric approach. And why do I do it? Because I get it. I mean, I didn't come out as a gay Christian man until almost 40 years old. It's because, as many of us in our community, the reconciling long-held beliefs and my love for Jesus was no easy task from my background. But thanks to God, he wouldn't have it, and he forced the issue, and I surrendered and came out just delightfully surprised that I am exactly as God intended me to be. And so that's why I do the work. I've been able to stay in evangelical spaces and be safe and help kind of move the needle to more productive conversations. So that's me. Start with you. Who you are, what you do, why you do it.
Hi, everyone. Well, okay. Hey, everyone. Oh, wow. Oh, good. Nice to see you all. My name is Brit, like Brian said, and I'm from Los Angeles, California. And I live there with my wonderful wife, Sammy, and I'm a speaker, an author, and a pastor at a church called New Abbey there in Los Angeles. And essentially, I feel like I exist to everything I do centers around storytelling. There are stories that we have consumed that we need to rewrite. There are stories that we need to reclaim. There are stories that need to be shared louder. And I love being a part of that work. And I say all the time, some of the most beautiful work that I get to do in my life is helping folks who feel like they have to choose who they are or what they believe, and realizing that you can have both and you can reclaim those stories, and that the stories and narratives of Jesus and your childhood and all the things that you learn are still yours, and we get to have them and reimagine them in a more inclusive and beautiful and bigger way. So that's me and what I do.
Thanks, Brett. What she said. I'm Grace. I identify as trans, she, her. I've been on this journey for about 3 years now, and I started the journey feeling like I absolutely need connection. And the way I figured out how to do that was by saying yes to anything that anybody asked me to do, which has led into a work with a variety of organizations, all volunteer, and has developed into a lot of the storytelling that Britt was talking about. My storytelling is typically one-on-one. I just have discovered that if I can stand face-to-face with someone and share my story, I can sometimes move the needle a little bit, at least in terms of how people see and understand the trans experience. I think family, I was married, would have been married for 48 years. We've been separated for about a year now since I fully transitioned to living as Grace, and so we're figuring that out at this point. Oh, you got one.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Bill, and my pronouns are he, him, and I pastor a small church in Long Beach, California, and lead an organization called Small Church Big Table. I've got 2 gay kids, 2 for 2, because God loves me. And it's the greatest gift of my life, just about. So, and I work with churches, particularly conservative evangelical churches, who are starting to have this conversation. And we sort of, our secret sauce is that we don't have an agenda for churches. We don't have an agenda for them to be traditional or affirming or third way or anything else, but rather create space for conservative churches to have these conversations, because honestly, a lot of the leaders are scared. They don't know how to have these conversations. They're worried about getting fired or losing funding or losing the kids in their youth group, and they feel stuck. And so we create space for those conversations around scripture and theology, and also around practice. And it's a true delight to be able to accompany people. Our church went on that journey about 10 years ago, and it was just the best thing our church has ever done. And I mean, our church is now very, it's probably a third queer, and it's just such a delightful group of folks. But I understand that as an evangelical pastor, you need space to go on that journey. So that's what we do.
Hi, my name is Danny Cortez. I use he, him. I live in Los Angeles area. I was pastoring a Southern Baptist church for about 15 years. Came to a place where I changed my theology. My 15-year-old son comes out, and you know, our church was removed from the Southern Baptist Convention. After that, I realized how much I had been doing harm in my pastoral work, so I wrote letters of apology to everyone who had ever come out to me in all my years of ministry. And that's kind of what I've been doing, is you know, trying to come alongside churches, faith communities, to help you know, us see the harm that we've been doing to people. And, you know, around that narrative, since then I started a nonprofit called Estuary Space, and from that another nonprofit started called Bridges in Africa, where we're trying to elevate the stories of LGBTQ people in Africa. We actually have a session right after this one. But yeah, so I'm kind of doing nonprofit work, and I pastor Long Beach Christian Fellowship. I'm one of the co-pastors there.
Great. Thanks for letting us see a little bit of who you are. Let's talk politics. Might be a risky place to start, but we were talking talking in advance of this, and we thought, at the risk of even derailing the focus of our topic, which is, LGBTQ plus reform in the church, I think we'd be remiss to not acknowledge what's on a lot of our minds, especially this week and in the last few months, and the impact of the incoming administration. So maybe Grace, let's start with you. How did the election season affect you and those close to you personally? And how does the current political landscape sort of impact your vocation or your thinking of how to move the needle ahead?
Well, I can honestly say that the election was a gut punch. I didn't expect it. I didn't understand it. But what it did tell me is that not only did I understand what was happening politically, I didn't understand what was happening in the lives of my neighbors all around me. I didn't realize that there was another way of thinking about this, that people close to me could hold differing views and could feel like that a vote for the current administration was actually a good thing to do. And that told me I've got a lot of work to do. I need to know my neighbors in ways that I didn't know them before. So I've been working to try to actually begin conversations with people who have a differing view and yet are part of the allies of our community, and trying to make sense of what that means, how they got there, and why I was so oblivious to what was really happening for them. And so that's really the way I've been trying to approach this thing. I realized after the election that, fear, you can spread fear from a distance pretty easily, but love has to be spread face to face. And if I'm going to make a change in the world that I'm living in, then that's where I'm going to be able to do it, by having face-to-face conversations, by being visible in my neighborhoods, by talking to my neighbors, by simply showing up in the world and trying to give a different narrative than the one that's currently being promoted out there. The thing that really gave me comfort after the election and even today is the fact that the people who loved me on Monday still loved me on Wednesday. The people who still loved me after the executive order still love me today, that my support system has not diminished in any way, and it is still within my capacity to add to that support system by bridging gaps, by having conversations, by getting to know people rather than arguing over ideologies. And so I still have a lot of hope for the future. I think the work is harder now, but the process feels exactly the same to me. Keep loving my neighbor as myself.
Love it. Who else? Same question.
I think to your point as well, I wrote a book about having relationships with people you disagree with, and came out in October. And
it's got the greatest title. What's the title?
It's called "Do You Still Talk to Grandma?" When the problematic people in our lives are the ones we love. And
it's a great book.
You read it on the book like on the way out here, or on the plane on the way out here.
You have to get it.
It's got the greatest cover. It's got like a phone with it's just perfect.
Completely unbiased. I love it. But I was joking earlier. I was on a bunch of podcasts in October, and every single one of them, you can listen back. I'm like, there's no way the election's going that way. Like, I didn't even think about it. But I continue to have the conversation. I said, regardless, when she wins, this is me quoting in October, we're still going to have a polarization problem in our country. And I've always said my work doesn't exist for strangers, because I don't think that strangers are where our work lies. It's always going to be solved around a table with people we know, in the relationships with the people that we have. And so why I had hoped to be preaching this message of empathy from the winning side, and be like, these poor losers, we should feel bad for them. It's the message still remains. And I think the distance and the gap that we see between neighbors, right? Neighbors, family, cousins, partners, college roommates, whatever it may be. I think it's just a doubling down for me of a reminder that my work is not with strangers, and that I think we need to have sit around more tables where we can have these honest conversations. And my curiosity went up to a level 10, I think. And I really want to know. All right, I've missed some things. Like let's talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the LGBTQ task force. I was speaking to the executive director, and she said about 20 years ago, they sent surveyors to California to, during Prop 8 about, marriage equality there. And they were asking people in the neighborhood on a scale of 0 to 10, how against are you against gay marriage? And whenever someone said they're against gay marriage, they followed it up with a second question. On a scale of 0 to 10, how against are you? 10 being very against. And to their surprise, most people didn't say 10. There were either a 6 or a 7 or an 8. And it helped them nuance it because they saw from that survey that not everyone is totally a 10, but if we find the 6s, can we help them become a 5?
Yeah.
If we find an 8, can we help them become a 7? And I think like the storytelling or moving the needle, sometimes it feels like, we want to just overhaul the whole system, get a new president, everything will be okay.
We all did. Sorry,
Yeah.
not we all. Sorry, but we did.
But
did.
really, it's the little work. It's the conversations. It's doing stuff like this. And it's not about trying to change someone from a 10 into a 0, but how do we humanize each person in every conversation where we're like, just telling the stories and helping them see a nuanced view of, what we see.
Oh, that's great. All right, let's move to the topic at hand. State of the church and LGBTQ plus reform. So I said, like in my work, contrary to conventional wisdom, I kind of, whether it's the minority or the majority, like I've been able to observe a lot of folks wanting to lean in differently on this subject, even from very conservative theological perspectives, even trying to separate orthodoxy versus orthopraxy or something like maybe, we can agree to disagree on this. However, how are we going to love our neighbor? How are we going to treat the people in and out of our congregation? But that's been my experience, and so maybe, Bill, if you don't mind leading, like just tell us about some examples of your work, your experiences, where you've seen progress, where you've seen challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I look at my own story. My brother came out to me in 1990. I did my first gay wedding 25 years later. As a pastor, I officiated my first gay wedding 25 years later. So, I mean, it was a 25-year journey for me. That's a long journey, right? And for many of us, our journeys to get to where we are today, it's been a long process. And so the hope I see is built around, again, I'm working with more conservative evangelicals who are starting to ask questions now, realizing that they're not treating LGBT people very well, and that's not what Jesus is like. And so they're like, that's weird. What do I do with that? So for example, last week we had a small church big table did a webinar for youth pastors. How do you pastor LGBTQ kids? Right. And so we had a panel of queer students, 5 queer students across the theological spectrum, because we have no agenda in our coaching. So, and we tell people we have no agenda for you to become affirming or traditional or third way or something else. We have no agenda. What we do is we create safe space for you to ask your questions and go on your journey, because we know it takes a long time. Right. And so, I mean, it was fantastic. These 5 queer students, so 2 trans students, 3 gay students, sharing their experiences in the church. So one is same-sex attracted, committed to celibacy, sharing her experiences, all the way through a trans student sharing, how he had to leave his church, his surgical transition, the rejection, all this stuff, and finally with a gay woman who said, just looks into the, it's on Zoom, and looks in the camera and says, I no longer identify as a Christian because of how the staff at my church treated me so much, with so much evil and hate. I could not follow their God. I mean, just striking your heart. But here are, there are 126 pastors, and it's probably 80-20 conservative, progressive. And it's such a gift. In Brit's book, she talks about progressive amnesia, right? With this,
Say that again. Progressive amnesia.
Do you want to? Can you summarize that in one sentence for us?
Yeah, it's essentially the how sometimes we can conveniently forget the time before we know what we know now.
Yeah.
And so we learn something new, and we learn about, we saw this a lot in 2020. We learn about racism on Monday. On Tuesday, we are full-fledged social justice warriors. The books haven't even arrived to our house that we ordered, and we're like trolling our aunt on Facebook,
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, so we're there for all of us who are on the journey at a different stage, and we love that. And the fact that we actually had 230 people sign up for this webinar, and a bunch couldn't make it because of time and this and the other. That's crazy. So that's what I see as hopeful.
It's interesting that you said that, because that's what I was thinking about the whole time you were talking. And I use this example all the time. So I came out to myself when I was 27, and then I didn't come out publicly until I was 30. And I remember before I told my parents, so I've thought about this every single day for 2.5 years. I've been in therapy every single week for 2.5 years, working through, am I okay? Am I going to go to hell? This was such a long process for me. I spent every single day talking to like my, now wife about it. She wasn't my wife then. That would have been bearing the lead. They would have known I was gay if I had a wife. And I, so for 2 years, this thing consumed my every waking moment before I told my parents. And I remember telling my parents and having, like, even feeling the tension in me of like, why do I expect them to immediately have the response that I have post 2.5 years of weekly therapy, thinking about it every single day, knowing about it, processing my friends, and all of these things, right? And it's that kind of same idea. I think all the time. It's so funny that you brought up Prop 8, because I was a senior at a conservative Christian college when Prop 8 came out, and I remember having a full-fledged like panic freak out in the ballot box because I didn't know what to do, because I had gay friends and I love them. But what if, I literally remember thinking, I'm not even joking, I remember thinking, I feel like I want to vote yes for gay marriage, but what if when I push this button, God comes back and I go to hell? This is like, this sounds to me now, like my theology now, I'm like, that's the wildest thing I've ever heard. But that was absolutely something I actually thought. And so when I think about people who are trapped in that same idea of thinking, I have so much empathy when I can remember that I sat in a ballot box thinking, if
Yes.
I might get struck by lightning if I vote yes for gay marriage. Me, a person who's now gay married. Like, this is, like I'm living the best life ever right now. But that I really thought that. And so being cognizant and aware of that, it really changes the expectations I have for like being like, oh, maybe this tweet will change everyone's mind, and realizing
I had a
it's
very
journey.
similar personal experience of my wrestling match with God. You got your 3 years and 2. It took me 6, so I should have had your therapist. Clearly. But I did have a therapist, but not as efficient as yours. Anyways, and I remember, like, I still, to this day, every once in a while, wonder if I got this wrong, if I'm honest. And that isn't because my faith, when I eventually, it was really God that did the work in me when I had to change my mind. But as churches, as parents, as queer folks, I had this wrestling match because it was very real, and that it really felt like my salvation was at stake. It felt like my relationship with God that I had my whole life was at stake. And it really was God that had to kind of blow through that. I couldn't, no matter how good a therapist is or isn't. And I eventually got on the other side of that. But as many of us know, when you sort of get into the other side of some of these topics, it's not because you have all this certainty. You realize that faith is about living in uncertainty and having a whole new perspective of what it means to follow God and trust that He's got us, even if we got this thing wrong. And so when I wake up in a cold sweat a couple times a year wondering if I got this wrong, it just causes me to just lean into God more. So it's okay with me that I remember that, because I think it keeps me close to empathizing with folks that I work with, where this is a very real struggle to reconcile long-held beliefs with this new stirring they have of compassion for LGBTQ plus people in their life.
Can I add something, Brian? So I didn't mention at the outset that I have 2 gay sons, and we, as part of the Assemblies of God, when Brian mentioned that I was Baptist, I said, "Oh, I wish I would have been Baptist," but no, I was Assemblies of God. So that's an even more challenging space to be queer in. But I had 2 gay sons, and I loved them, but I absolutely destroyed the relationship I had with my son, trying to constantly convince him to, make a different choice. I didn't understand. And eventually we got to a place where I was able to say, "I don't know." And I thought that was enough, because now we don't have to have these conversations anymore. And, if you'll let us into your life, gosh, we will never talk about this again. And that, feels like massive progress. For us. We went through church with a sort of a don't ask, don't lie, or don't tell, don't lie approach. So we're not going to say anything, but if anybody asks us, we'll absolutely tell the truth about our family. Nobody asked us in 20 years. So we went through this period of 20 years where it felt like it's okay just to say, "I don't know." And then I come out to myself as trans in 2016. The first thought I have is I'm crazy. The second thought I have is I'm going to hell. And I realize in that moment, it's what my sons have been living with for the last 20 years. Because I realize in that moment, I don't know is absolutely not enough. I have to know if I'm going to figure out how to live my life. I'm deeply disappointed in myself that it took my own experience of queerness to help me to see my sons and to do the work not only for me but for them. But if you can imagine, neither one of them has any interest in walking with God today, because the last thing they heard 25 years ago was God hates them. And then I said, "Well, now I don't know if he does or not. So 50-50 chance. What are you going to do?" So absolutely, one of the things that really impassions me, that I find the most traction for me in my own life, is just simply bringing up the fact with people in general, often church people. People would accuse me all the time, why does it have to involve queer people? Because I would just always talking, people ask me, "What do you do?" "Well, I work with parents who have queer kids, trying to, help them figure out ways to love their kids better." "And why you do that?" "Well, because I didn't love mine very well." And it's been amazing, this intersection of being the parent and being queer, and discovering that most parents really do want to love their kids like I did, and feel so constrained, so unable to, by this theology that we've inherited and that I taught. I was a pastor for 32 years. And how important it is to find a space to be able to say, I'll process that somewhere else. Right now I'm just going to love my children the way that God loves me. And that I can do that all day long. I don't care who's in the White House. I don't care what somebody's political position is. People most often love their kids. And if I can give them permission to do that, I can move that needle a little more. Thanks, Danny, for reminding us that not everybody's a 10. Most people aren't, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good stuff. I remember when we were preparing, you two were getting into the business of talking about third way, which is something that, like, I've never really understood what that meant. It's just one of those words where, like, it's like affirming. Like, everybody has a different definition, right? Inclusive, affirming, third way in between, I'm not sure. But it was just sort of fascinating how you talked about your journey with your church and when it was good and when it wasn't. And then, Bill, you kind of had some around that. Do you mind sharing some of that, Danny?
Sure. So my Southern Baptist Church in 2014, when I told my congregation I had become affirming in my theology, they moved really quickly to terminate me. And then we found Ken Wilson's book, Letter to My Congregation, where he introduces this third way. And their church was going through it at the same time, a vineyard church over in the East. And so we brought it up to our church. And so we pushed it for about 6 months, and it went to a vote. And at the time, the church voted 60% to 40% to become third way. And third way for us basically meant that we won't, that the theological disagreement around LGBTQ inclusion and the relationships won't be a deciding factor whether we remain in fellowship. In other words, a pastor like me who is theologically affirming can officiate a gay wedding, while a conservative pastor will also be given permission not to officiate. And so we were kind of, giving a space for differences of beliefs and places. And in 2014, that made the most sense for my church because I was the only affirming leader in the church, and there was only, that I knew of, only one affirming congregant. The rest of the members we have no idea what we believe, but we think that we need to give grace. And so a lot of the LGBTQ people at the time felt like this is what we need. They wanted to remain in fellowship. This is what we want to have. And for a few years, that became the place I was pastoring. Fast forward, 2021, I get asked to be a pastor at Long Beach Christian Fellowship. And a few months before, they had just become third way. And so when I got on, they showed me the third way document. And I said, this all sounds good on paper, but it's one thing to have it on paper. It's another thing to pay attention to LGBTQ voices in the church. How does this land for them?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as, we were going through the, how it landed, it turned out that a lot of LGBTQ voices in our church, this wasn't good because they were still feeling like second-class citizens, where we give space for people to believe our relationships are sinful. And if there's a missionary that comes in, we would give space for theological disagreement. Right. And so that's why we made the decision about 1.5 years ago to become fully affirming. And so I've been part of 2 churches now that made a shift. One was from total conservative to third way, and more recently, third way to affirming. But that's all to say that every church and every place is different. And, I wouldn't say every church has to follow my first church or second church, but every church has to nuance the conversation for their own people, especially the LGBTQ voices.
And when your current church went from third way to affirming, what was your process? How did you guys approach that? Was it tricky, challenging, long, short?
It was really challenging because for a lot of the leaders, they thought they had made a monumental step. We're now third way. They had been in existence for almost 40 years already. And so for a lot of the, the leaders, it was like, what do you mean you want more? And so we had to elevate the voices. And so all the LGBTQ people actually wrote letters to the board members and compiled it in this little thing where these are the reasons why. And so it was a lot of storytelling. It was a lot of relationship building. It was a lot of me meeting with the more conservative community, trying to process. It was our leadership having the hard conversations. But really, the main goal for me was trying to listen to the stories. It's not a theological argument that we're going to debate, but it's real people where a document affects them. And
yes.
How do we live into their realities?
Yes. And before we go to Bill, one more question. What kind of fallout did you experience when you made a decision and voted to go affirming?
Yeah, unfortunately, we had some leaders leave, a pastor and some elders. We had some long-term members leave. And so the big fallout was, we had a financial crisis. But when I first started the church, if I can share another story,
Yes.
I came in being hired to help navigate the racial conversation and the LGBTQ conversation. And as I was meeting with the leaders, I said, before we get into this, I want to know something. We're inside the church building. And I said, I need to know, are we willing to lose the building? Because I meet with enough pastors where that's what's in back of their mind. I don't want to take this conversation to the point where I'm going to lose my job. And so my first question to the leadership was, are we willing to lose the building? Because if we're going to go in this conversation, we might lose a lot of people. We might lose our jobs. And so I need to know that we are so committed to like paying attention to the voice of God that we are willing to risk whatever it takes, as long as we pay attention to like what the Spirit might be leading us to. And that's what kind of happened. We're at a place now where, we're trying to recover. But I think, the trajectory is going, in a positive way, where we are now like, more people are finding out about our church, especially in this landscape, that are looking for a church like ours.
Counting the cost in advance, I think, is so important. I'm sort of the hopeless optimist sometimes, because I feel like every pastor is so like, that's the thing they're so afraid of, that I almost want to illustrate stories of you can use good process and have maybe less fallout than you think, but you still have to count the cost going into it. Yeah. Bill.
Yeah, I think, LBCF is a sister church of ours, and we love it, and I send people there regularly. In fact, I just talked with Kent. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you're at LBCF.
So you're like competing churches in the same town.
No, I love it. I send people literally
both in Long Beach.
I send people to LBCF all the time, regularly. Our experience with Third Way has been different. I think when people look at us from the outside, it's like, well, that's obviously an affirming church, right? But it's not on paper that you have to be affirming to be in leadership. In fact, we have people in leadership who do not believe in gay marriage, and we're fine with that. Because for us, Third Way is not just about LGBT questions, it's about theological diversity. And we recognize that within all of our churches, there's a lot of theological diversity. So our tradition baptizes infants. Well, only half the kids in our church are baptized, which suggests that half the parents in the church don't believe in sort of that tradition. That's fine. Like, we're not going to get up and mock anyone for that. So for our experience of Third Way, I think partly because we're always trying to center the margins. That's just something our church, that's kind of one of our core values. And so we always have queer voices on stage, sharing, coming out, and lots of clapping. And, we do Affirmation Sunday, and we, March in Pride and all that stuff that people are just like, well, obviously you're an affirming church, which is fine. I love that. It's just that there's a lot of theological diversity in our church, and we've been on that journey, and we honor that, and we feel great about it. I don't feel the need to do sort of the Jedi mind control over everybody to make them think what I think, because I don't think what I think, at least what I thought last week. I've changed it already, so it's like we're always on this journey and trying to create space for that. So sort of a different experience a little bit, and not to invalidate, but just to say, yeah, different churches go about the process different ways. And it's usually a long journey for a conservative church to make a shift.
Speak to what I just mentioned a second ago. Like, I know that you and I have talked a lot about this. Like, you also share my optimism, probably as well as counting the cost. But, flesh that out a little bit with like how you coach churches, and like maybe even some stories of churches that, have done this process really well and have been able to mitigate the losses maybe better than like the pastors might have thought going into the process.
Yeah, there are a lot of churches are doing really well at this process, and we're coaching we're doing individualized coaching with a couple of churches, one in San Francisco, one in LA right now, who they might lose a family, but one of them's probably 300 people, the other's probably 100, but I don't think either of them are going to lose anyone on this process. They're doing it so thoughtfully. They're taking it slow. It's hard for some of the leaders because they get some pressure from both sides. But as you create space and conversation, we have this sort of 6-stage curriculum that we lead evangelicals through. And it takes a while. It's a process, and there's scripture, and there's discernment, and there's conversation and conflict, and but it's just a delight, because what happens is like you build your community muscle, and you build a sense of freedom, like, oh my gosh, we could actually be who we are. And so these churches, it's just delightful to see churches turn those corners. And Mark Wingfield writes about his church, Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, in the book.
Yep.
Why churches need to talk about
Sexuality. It's a really long title.
Yeah,
but
it's a great book.
But it's brilliant. Yeah,
And they did their process super well. And they remark on they lost some folks and gained some folks. And I mean, so there's definitely a lot of hope in the journey for the churches, particularly that try to do it really thoughtfully with a lot of love and care for everyone. So.
And specifically, I mean, I think you all know what we're talking about, but like process meaning the church has hit some sort of point where they know that they have to intentionally revisit what are our policies and practices going to be around LGBTQ plus people and make a decision at the end.
Because they've got queer kids in the youth group, right? Or one of the band leaders, they realize, oh my gosh, he's married to a man, or whatever it is, right? And they realize, oh, we're going to need to talk, and then they have to start on a journey.
How about Brit and Grace? Do you two? I don't even. Oh, I know you do. Do you go to church now? And would you call it affirming or inclusive or third way or welcoming or stuck in the Stone Ages? Like, where's your church at? And have you been a part of that process? Either of you?
So I'm really thinking about this process not in terms of a church level, but in terms of a family level. You know, that organism, that's the word that I'm wanting. And how there's a need for an intentional process there as well. I was thinking about Sammy and Sharon this morning in the main session, and how Sammy was so strategic in kind of gently leading his mom along to a place where he could eventually come out to her. But even after all of this long process, there was still that fear in his mind that this announcement, that this revelation could wreck the family. And there's always this counting of costs that has to happen. I know when I first began this journey, the last thing I wanted was for it to cost me my marriage. And so we spent 7 years trying to figure out a way forward. And, you know, keep in mind that my family already is well acquainted with the LGBTQ conversation, having had 2 gay sons.
Right.
So I discovered that sometimes this conversation, at least in our setting, really had not a lot to do with biblical thoughts or theology and so forth. There were like just personal ways of understanding sexuality and attraction and so forth that eventually proved insurmountable for my wife and I. And, you know, here I am as a trans woman desperately wanting to stay married to my wife and asking her, would you allow me to be authentic in our relationship, and realizing that in the same moment, I need to be offering that very same thing to her as a straight cisgender woman. And would she have chosen this relationship?
Yeah.
Given who she is? And the answer is no, she would not. So to ask her to choose it now is completely unfair. And I think there's a lot of that dynamic that happens even in the church conversation, that,
yes,
you know, once we get the policies in place and we have the theology all lined up, we still have to be aware of the fact that people have feelings and ideas and ways, you know, stuff that happens inside their bodies when they're thinking about this conversation. And those conversations, I think, need to be willing to be had as well, with the realization that there is often always a cost. I can't have everything I want. And no matter how hard I try or how well I try to engage the process, but I can try to show up with the same offering to my spouse and my family that I'm asking them to make to me, and figure out, how do we move forward together? We're not married. We're kind of a third way family at this point. we are figuring out what it means to be separated, what it means to have family that we love deeply and grandkids that we want to continue to nurture together if possible. And so there's this constant negotiation around all of that, despite the fact that all the theology is all ticked off and, you know, we all believe we're affirming and, you know, we're celebrating as much as we can the identities that each of us have. So I guess I'm just saying that to say that there's always this cost that has to be considered. And I, as the queer person, also have to recognize that there is a cost for those who are in connection and relationship with me, and to be at least understanding of that cost.
Yeah.
Even as I hope that they would be understanding, you know, of me.
So good.
I have one hot take, and it's not to derail the conversation.
Do it.
But
Do it. I was going to go in another direction anyway, so you take us there, Britt.
Okay. Well, I want to know I was just thinking of, I think you're absolutely right. There's always a cost. And I think you're right. We're always afraid of the losses. And something I think about, before I was a pastor at New Abbey, I was a pastor at a conservative evangelical mega church. So more lights and lasers than scripture, but it was there. And one of my favorite things about being a pastor at New Abbey is, so our church is 11 years old, and we started as affirming, but no one on staff, none of the pastors. This isn't it's no one's full-time job. So this is not how any of us survive and make money. And I used to not like that. And my current hot take is I think that is like my favorite thing. I think after I left the megachurch, I said, I never want what I believe to be tied up with how I'm going to survive. Because I think that immediately the stakes get so high.
Yes,
but we change our mind all the time. I'll change my mind next week. I'll change my mind. Our church knows like what, you know what I mean? We're all, there's a sense that we're all in it together. Because we, you know, kind of are. And so I think it's a beautiful thing to disentangle that. It's been beautiful for me to disentangle the finances from, this is something that I want to do because I want to do it. This isn't something that I need everyone to be in these seats so that I can, you know, pay my mortgage.
That's really good.
Where were you going now? Because I want to know.
No, it's good. Let's one more question around the horn here. I think we have about another 10 minutes together. So maybe let's go to sort of more of a little more of a foundational question about like polarization, you know, current state of affairs that we all know and love well or not, and finding common ground. So love your neighbor and what it means to follow Jesus apparently appears up for debate these days amongst Christians, and you know, quite a culture war between some Christians and the LGBTQ plus community. You know, civil discourse, common ground, pretty hard to find. That's what your book's about, right? So tell me about some of your perspectives or stories, experiences about what does it look like to find unity and common ground when you believe things very differently? Big question, but I think you'll know where to take it.
Yeah, so something actually we say in our church every single week is we want unity, not uniformity. And I think there is a lot more common ground. Something I talk about a lot is I live in Los Angeles. We have so many people in our city who don't have a roof over their head, have a place to sleep. And everyone in the city doesn't like that. There's not anyone who sees that and is like, yeah, you know. But everyone has a different idea of why that is, how that is, what we should do about it, how long it should take to do something about it, who's in charge of doing something about it, why we would do something about it. Do we need
the one thing you all agree upon is that it's not okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot as I enter into conversations. And there's a bunch of, I literally did, my whole book is about this. So there's like a lot of things I think about it, but I think the three main things we need to do are sort of break out of our binary thinking. I think a lot of us, and I say us as human beings, like the certainty and the idea that there's a right side of the wrong line and a wrong side of the line, and that we somehow, through coming to QCF or reading the right books or doing all the right things, we find ourselves exclusively on the right side of the line. And I think the more we can erase that and realize that it's actually kind of a web that we're all trying to untangle together, then we do the second thing I think we need, which is empathy. And I say all the time, it's just a broken record, empathy is not an endorsement. People say all the time, how can I empathize with people who want violence? Or how can I empathize with these people who are doing this fascist regime? And how can I have empathy? Like, because it's more for us than it is for them. It's a humanizing thing. And it's not an endorsement. It's just saying, I understand that you're a human being and this is what you think. And I can understand how you got there. I can understand. I know how comforting it feels to have all the right answers. I know what it feels like to sit in a seat and be like, oh, thank God I found the right translation and the right scripture. And I said the right prayer on the right day and got baptized in the right way, that I am the one going up in the elevator when this thing's over. But to know that there are other people that think that. And so I think it's something there's one story I'll tell. And in the book, I talk about watching this documentary about flat earthers. Anyone? Yeah. Anyone? Is there flat? Yeah. And yes, it was fascinating. So the guy making the documentary went to this flat earth conference. Okay, there's whole conferences. And he's like interviewing people and he's like, science, da, da, da. And they're like, flat, whatever. And he's going back and forth, and then he sits down in this one interview and he's like, the earth is round and we have all this evidence and science, and the other guy starts giving some feedback, and then the other guy does something where I'm like, that is it. That is the whole thing. I think that is what this guy says, at the end of the day, it's really hard to make friends. And I found this group on Facebook and we talk every day. I go to 2 conferences a year, and these are the people who feed my cats when I go out of town. And in that moment, I realized this guy doesn't care if there's triangle, square, octagon. I'll say whatever I have to say about the earth if I can have a connection to people who are going to feed my cats when I go out of town. And so I like to say often, very rarely are we arguing facts with people. We're arguing against their sense of belonging. And if we realize that that's what we're doing, then we have such a different kind of empathy when we approach those conversations. And so I think when it comes to common ground and unity and discourse, it starts with realizing we're talking to human beings who have connected a sense of belonging to some kind of ideological structure. And that's a painful thing to leave. It was painful for me to leave. Yes, I do want people to leave it, ultimately, like get out. But I remember how painful it was. And so, yeah.
I was just thinking about how to actually embody the love of Jesus on a day-by-day basis. And Brit, you just gave this beautiful illustration of what really matters to people, which is connection. If it doesn't matter what it's built around, but if there's connection there, then that's what's going to draw a person. And I've discovered that. I realized in looking at the life of Jesus that he was all about connection. You very rarely hear him talking about anything related to sin or change or anything of that nature. A couple of times maybe, always after he's already demonstrated connection. And one of the things that I've discovered works really well in connecting with people is curiosity about who they are, and then offering points of intersection between your life and theirs, which is why often when I'm talking to parents, because I have gay children, I will find some way to mention that in the conversation. I can't tell you how many times parents will come back to me later on and say, gosh, you mentioned that you have gay kids and you were like okay with that. And next thing I know, we've got conversation going on about that. Why? Because there's connection. There's a similarity. So I just try to leverage every point of intersection that I have. I was a pastor for 32 years. So if a pastor's, thinking about doing something in their church, hey, let me talk to you about my experience. I love the fact that I'm trans, especially because it seems to be such a difficult conversation to have these days. I love sitting on a plane and starting a conversation with someone and connecting with them in that way, just being curious. It's amazing to me how much people need that in this culture and how easy it is to offer it. And then at some point, if it seems appropriate, to offer the fact that, oh, did you know you were just talking to a trans person? And, hopefully they're walking away from that experience with like, what? I just felt something that felt really, I got a text this week from a person who's moving from Mexico to Canada to start a new job. They were leaving everything behind. All they had was their minivan. Their wife and children were still there. They were going up to Canada. They had no idea what was going to happen. We ended up having like a 2 or 3 hour conversation on the plane. And he just comes back out of Canada. While he was there, his texts were blocked. But as soon as he gets back in the United States, first thing he does is he texts me and says, hey, how are you? Really loved that conversation on the plane. That was such an easy gift to offer someone. So, whatever your points of intersection are, if you can express curiosity towards someone, offer connection to them, that's what moves the needle more than anything else, at least in my experience.
So good. Danny?
Yeah, there's a story I like to share that I think still forms me to this day. When my church went through that split in 2014, I also wrote letters to the people that left, and I said, you know what, I understand that that we can't be in the same church, but can we be friends? Most of the people didn't reply to that letter, but there was one couple that did. A couple of years later, we met over at Starbucks, and I could tell they didn't want to meet. And when they finally sat down, they said, Danny, you know what, you keep writing us, but we want you to know that we don't understand what kind of relationship we could have with you because we see you flying around the country. And we believe that Satan is using you to destroy our nation. And I remember not knowing where to take this conversation from there. And as they were getting ready to leave, I remember in the conversation that, this is an Asian couple that always addressed me as pastor. And in this conversation, they called me Danny for the first time, which I don't have a problem with, but I knew for them, there was a reason for that. And so as they were getting there ready to leave, I remember just saying, wait, can you hold on? Can I say one last thing? I can understand if you no longer see me as a pastor and therefore no longer address me as pastor. I can also understand if you no longer see me as your friend and love me as your friend. But will you be willing to love me as your enemy? And they looked puzzled. They were like looking at each other. What does that even mean? And so I said, well, I want to know that I feel like there's this thing between us right now that is preventing love from being transacted. If you're sick, I want to know that I can come at any time and bring you food and bring you care. And I want you to know that you have permission to do that for me. But right now, there is something that is keeping love from happening. And so for me, the greatest commandment is to love. To not love is the greatest sin. And so can we figure this out where even though we disagree, could we figure out what it means to love? And they were like, we have no idea what this looks like, but they said, okay. And the beautiful thing was about a month later, we saw them at a service. It was an unfortunate thing. Our common friend died. But once we saw each other from across the room, we made a beeline towards one another and we hugged each other. And that wouldn't have happened before. But I think that's what, what I pray will happen, that we, we have our differences. And like Grace, you were talking about, they're still my neighbors. What does it look for us to, really pay attention to the great commandment? And just, how do we love? How do we love well? That's something that we got to figure out.
So good. I'm gonna end it on that note. Thanks a lot, Danny. I really appreciate that. Thank you, panelists. Really good conversation. We could keep going for a while. A couple of things. I have a table for making things right. So if you want to come meet me and learn about what we're doing and these ministry partners that I work with, come there. Brit, you're doing a book signing out there for a couple hours soon after this. So if you want to meet this fabulous person, she'll be out there as well. And thank you all for the conversation. I hope we served you up some hope. Thanks.